Good afternoon, everyone. Really welcome to this UCA talk series. And today we have a great honor to have invited Professor Susan Shirk, a well-known, highly respected scholar and former diplomat on China. The UCA, if you do not know very well, is a national Chinese American organization whose primary mission is to enhance the civil rights engagement and participation of our communities. And of course, one of our mission is also to promote a better understanding and communications between the peoples of the two countries. Professor Shirk's book is about the U.S.-China relations. And this is a really timely, very, very timely occasion right after China's Communist Party's 20th Congress. A lot of interest and questions and concerns has been raised about this relationship, and I truly believe that Professor Shirk will give her very best to give us a good talk on that very, very important issues. Now, from her previous book a decade ago, her previous book I have in mind, she had many books. The book I have in mind is what is called A Fragile Superpower, to overreach a superpower that could overreach or could overreact, whatever you would say on that. It is a short 10 or 15 years, and a lot has happened during that 10 or 15 years, and I would like to take this opportunity to listen to Professor Shirk about what has really happened. Your floor now, Professor.
Well, thank you so much, Taipei, for giving me the honor to address your membership and other interested Chinese Americans. United Chinese Americans is a really important organization that should be playing an important role in helping the American government craft a policy toward this rapidly changing China in a way that's not just good for Americans, but is also good for the entire world by maintaining peace and economic and social growth in the whole world, as well as together addressing issues like climate change, public health, etc. So I'm an old China hand. I first went to China in 1971. I've been very fortunate in having the opportunity to serve in government from 97 to 2000. And for pretty much all of my career, after 1976, when Mao Zedong passed away, China has been moving in a positive direction, and US-China relations have been moving in a positive direction. So, you know, being a China hand, a China scholar, has been a very happy experience, because I have been watching things get better for everyone, improving people's lives in China, and China's relations with the United States and other countries also improving. And that's really due largely to the policies that China's leaders embraced. They pursued a strategy of self-restraint and tried to reassure the world that even as its capabilities improved, including its military capabilities as well as its economic capabilities, that it wasn't a threat because its intentions were benign. Then in the mid-2000s, as I'm watching this in real time, I saw things start to change. And this was actually even before the global financial crisis. In foreign policy, in the South China Sea, we saw that the civilian maritime agencies and their ships were starting to challenge the Southeast Asian countries that also claimed parts of the South China Sea. And domestically, we saw a tightening up of control over the media and internet and over civil society. And this began actually right before the Olympics. And at the time, I thought, and many of us thought, well, this is just what we often see before major events in China, and things will go back to normal, they'll loosen up afterwards. But in this case, they never loosened up ever again. The other thing that was happening domestically was that the state was, after several decades of market decentralization, the state was coming back in to take more of an active role over the economy in pursuit of indigenous innovation. So this was kind of a puzzle to me, and I tried to figure out what was going on because this was a period of collective leadership in China. The Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao administration was following the direction that Deng Xiaoping had established when he came in to be China's effective leader at the end of the 1970s, and tried to institutionalize and make more predictable Chinese governance. And he did that by introducing retirement ages, term limits for the top leadership, 2-term limits, and to have the collective institutions of the party meet more frequently and therefore exercise greater oversight over the top leadership. Because from Deng's perspective, the biggest problem in Chinese politics and the reason for the tragic mistakes of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong was the over-concentration of authority, which led to arbitrary decision-making. So Deng Xiaoping carried out what you might call a form of de-Maoization and established a more this collective rule in which you had 9 top leaders of the party, each with different responsibilities. And, you know, it was kind of surprising that this, what I call overreach, and let me just give you a quick definition of overreach. Overreach means to do things in an exaggerated way, to take things too far in a manner that comes back to be costly to yourself. So it's self-defeating actions is what is the dictionary definition of overreach. So these things happened in Chinese foreign policy and domestic policy, beginning in this period of collective leadership, when we might predict, in fact, that all the top leaders in the collective leadership would check one another and prevent any of this kind of overreach, that they would be more, they would restrain one another. But that's not what happened. So if you read my book, I have an explanation which has to do with the decentralized character of collective leadership, in which the different bureaucratic interests went their own way. Nobody stopped them. Hu Jintao didn't stop them. Their colleagues didn't stop them. And you had overreach, both in foreign policy and domestic policy. The other thing that you had in the period of collective leadership was public splits in the leadership. We saw Bo Xilai challenging Xi Jinping's ascension of power in 2012. And we also had rampant corruption. And the splits in the leadership and the corruption enabled Xi Jinping to make the case for a stronger, more concentrated leadership. So the party elite supported that idea, but they ended up with a leader who concentrated power to the extent that Deng Xiaoping might have been critical of as over-concentration of power, which wasn't necessarily what they thought they were getting. And under Xi Jinping's system of centralized personalistic leadership, overreach has intensified, both in foreign policy and domestic policy. And we would expect the third term to be even more extreme. And if you look at the 20th Party Congress, you'll see why we might predict that the third term would see even more overreach. And let me talk about that in a minute. But let me first explain how the type of arrangements that Xi Jinping has put in place, the type of system that he's established as this concentrated personalistic leadership with cult of personality, has resulted in overreach. First of all, there are no other voices at the very top in the standing committee to question Xi Jinping's decisions. And there's tremendous top-down pressure on subordinates, on the lower level officials from the very top because of this massive anti-corruption campaign that Xi Jinping initiated 10 years ago that continues to this very day. About 5 million Chinese officials have been disciplined in this anti-corruption campaign. And it's not just about corruption. It's also aimed at getting rid of all political rivals to Xi Jinping and preventing any disloyalty to the party and to the leader. It's really what Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor under Jimmy Carter and Soviet expert, what he called a permanent purge, because now in this third round of purging that we see just this past year, we see that many of the top officials in the internal security and party discipline bureaucracies, who themselves had been so trusted that they were in charge of the investigations of the high-level leaders in the first two rounds of the purge. Now they themselves have been charged with corruption and with plotting against the party. Fu Jianhua, Sun Lijun, these are two of the high-level leaders who have now just been put in jail for life. Actually, they were given death penalties, suspended death penalties, which means they're never going to leave prison. So this purge has, and the emphasis on loyalty under Xi Jinping has created a climate of fear on lower level officials. And so what we see is the officials are competing with one another to try to rise up in the system and to, of course, prevent themselves from being targeted by the anti-corruption campaign. And how do they show their loyalty? How do they compete with one another, get noticed for being the most loyal? They do it by bandwagoning on Xi Jinping's policy preferences, and that propels policy toward a more extreme version of it than Xi Jinping may originally have wanted himself. So you prove your loyalty by your zealous overcompliance with Xi's policies. So you can understand why that drives this kind of overreach. Another critical element in this whole mechanism is that the information feedback loops are not working because no subordinates dare tell Xi Jinping the truth about the negative consequences of his policies for fear that they would be punished for bringing him this kind of bad news. So this is the kind of dynamic that actually led to the abuses of the local officials in the Great Leap Forward under Mao. And it's very disturbing to see the same thing happening in the implementation of zero COVID today. When you look at how the local officials go overboard in their imposing regular testing, quarantining, Guiyang local officials taking people out to quarantine them outside the city in a bus, leading to a tragic accident in which people were killed. I mean, these local officials were trying to prove that they're doing a good job and that they're loyal to the party and to Xi Jinping in a manner that leads to a really extreme social control, forced quarantining, lockdowns, testing, surveillance, and local officials really have no choice but to impose these things on the public. So this type of overreach we also see in foreign policy, in the wolf warrior diplomacy, in the intensification of military pressure against Japan, against Taiwan, the pressure, economic coercion against Australia for calling for an international scientific investigation of the origins of COVID. So we see this kind of overreach being driven not just by misjudgments or policy mistakes of Xi Jinping, but this type of system that tends to amplify the negative effects of these misjudgments. You look at the reaction of the world now, and there's a backlash, not just in the United States, but also certainly in Europe. The European reaction, especially to Xi Jinping's aligning with Putin in a way that indicates at least tacit and ideological support of his brutal, unprovoked war in Ukraine. This type of overreach is causing a backlash in many, and especially advanced industrial countries, but also in the third world. And of course, the domestic costs to some of Xi Jinping's systems overreaching, such as the crackdown against the private platform economy, the companies that private companies in internet businesses, but not just internet businesses, also after school tutoring and other types of businesses are creating tremendous domestic costs, including the return of unemployment as a problem in the Chinese economy. And so unfortunately, what we see now is a system which is producing policies that put a priority on security, on ideological loyalty, and instead of a priority on economic development. You know, the Chinese Communist Party used to be synonymous with development first. And even though Xi Jinping in his work report to the 20th Party Congress did say that the #1 priority remains economic development, it was pretty clear from the rest of the report that, in fact, security and ideological loyalty are actually in first place. Now, so that's my kind of analysis of how how China's gone from a policy of self-restraint to a policy of overreach. And it didn't begin with Xi Jinping, but it has certainly taken a more extreme form in this system of more concentrated leadership. And so to the rest of the world, China now appears like much more of a threat. And that's really the reason that in the United States and in many other countries, you get a policy toward China, which is getting tougher. And we are pursuing various forms of restrictions on the economic and technological interdependence between our two countries. Now, I've been arguing that although China is overreaching, and we need to understand that and see that clearly, the United States should not overreact. We need to continue to try to encourage the Chinese leadership to moderate its policies through diplomacy. We should not give up on diplomacy. We really haven't had any serious negotiations between the two countries for 6 years. Communication lines have thinned. Of course, COVID has contributed to the problem because our two leaders now have not been able to meet face to face, even though they actually have established a personal relationship from the time that they were both vice president. So it's very fortunate that it appears that they will be meeting face to face at the G20 meeting in Bali in a couple of weeks. But what I see on the US side, I would call an overreaction to China's overreaching. I think we should continue to test whether or not that pragmatic gene that other Chinese leaders had of trying to reduce the costs to their national interests by being flexible and being willing to make some compromises through negotiation in their foreign policy, whether or not that pragmatic attitude still exists. It doesn't appear apparent. Certainly at the 20th Party Congress, we didn't hear any evidence of that, but I think we still need to test it, because otherwise, to pursue a policy which is basically to try to degrade, contain China's development economically and technologically alone is bound to lead to military conflict. And it's also not in the interests of America's own competitiveness. America is really the secret of American success is America's openness. Openness to foreign investment, openness to talented people who come to the United States, attend our world-class colleges, and then stay here and start businesses and do great research and contribute to America in a multitude of ways. Or maybe they go back to their home country and then become partners with Americans in various kinds of joint efforts. So openness of our market economy and our society is really critically important to American success. So to put up walls, as we're basically doing between the US and China, is going to be very damaging to ourselves as well as to the entire global economy. And finally, one consequence of these policies in which we harm ourselves in order to try to punish China is that we now have created a big anti-Americanism problem in China. Chinese people were not anti-American before a couple of years ago, but they certainly are today. And so I think we need to find ways, and hopefully we can take advantage of the meeting between the two presidents to try to send some reassuring signals to the people of both countries that the governments are trying to figure out ways to stabilize relations and manage their differences in a manner which is not too devastating to the entire world or potentially could lead to war. So I'm not sure whether or not diplomacy will work with Xi Jinping's concentrated leadership system. I'm genuinely agnostic about that, but I believe that we at least have to test it, and we shouldn't give up on diplomacy too soon. So I think I'll just end it there, and I look forward to your questions. And I certainly hope that many of you will find your curiosity stimulated by what I've said, and are curious about how did this work under collective leadership of Hu Jintao and Mike. Go out, buy the book, and I look forward to hearing what you think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Shirk, for your amazing talk. I really want to encourage everybody here to buy a book or buy extracts, share that with your friends. And there are a lot of stories inside that book. I think you and I usually don't know, and even some that we know that we have never thought about it in the perspective that Professor Shirk has. Now, I would like to also thank Guanglei of 21st Century at the UC San Diego for working with our team and with Xi Hong, and today's events got a lot of help from Xiao Xiao and Gary Yu. Now, we have about 3 or 4 pre-selected questions from when you registered with us. We have a choice there. You can leave a question. So we have selected 3 or 4 there, and after that, we'll open up to the general audience for a few more questions. And let me, before that, let me take advantage of my today being the moderator, and I want to ask a first question to you, Professor Shirk. I know this is a very generous question, but I think people still want to hear, especially hear from you. And that is, with the closing of the Chinese Communist Party's 20 Congress, if you have a crystal ball, I insist you have, if you have a crystal ball, what's your general view about the next 5 or 10 years under that kind of leadership in terms of China relation? And bear also in mind, we have a pretty strong bipartisan view towards China too these days. And second, related to that, so under that prediction of yours, what do you think is the role of Chinese American can play in this gigantic relationship, especially considering the special background of the historical position the Chinese American have in this country, the Red Scares, the red baiting, the McCarthyism, and there are also a few bad apples in our community. So all of that factors, what's the role of our community?
Well, it's hard to be optimistic about U.S.-China relations right now, for sure. And what we see in the 20th Party Congress is that Xi Jinping has gotten rid of not just the term limits in order to have a 3rd term for himself, but also eliminated the age parameters, the retirement age parameters, which have structured political competition in China up and down the ladder for several decades now. And he did that to eliminate leaders like Li Keqiang, Wang Yang, Hu Chunhua, who might have joined the standing committee and questioned some of Xi Jinping's policy choices, provided a different perspective, and maybe a perspective that put a higher priority on economic development than Xi Jinping does. So what he did is free up 4 slots by getting rid of those rules so that he could surround himself basically with yes men, with loyalists who have risen up in the system because Xi Jinping favors them, and not necessarily the most capable. This is a system that actually my first book, I coined the term virtuocracy, of a type of system contrasting with meritocracy, in which political loyalty is the key to career success and selection of officials. So, it's hard to feel optimistic because the information feedback loops and the pressure on subordinate officials, all of those problems are going to persist unless there's more power sharing at the top. So I'm not too sanguine about any major adjustments, moderations of Chinese policy over the next 5 years. On the other hand, the economic costs to China are really piling up. And the domestic and the foreign backlash, the global backlash, is growing as well. So I'm always happy to be proven wrong about this. And, I haven't given up hope. There are many Americans who have just given up hope that we can work out differences with China peacefully, diplomatically, and they've concluded that China is an enemy already. But as you noted, Haipei, this is actually very recent change. And for so many decades before then, our two countries were managing to get along pretty well. So I think the United States should make every effort, a renewed effort, to try to resolve differences through diplomacy. Now, our own domestic environment is not conducive to that, as you noted. And after the midterms, it could actually get worse in America if we have different parties completely controlling Congress than the White House. On the other hand, this bipartisan consensus, which seems to have developed that China is the main threat to the United States, which I find a totally ludicrous idea, considering that Russia, although it's economically weaker, has just invaded another country, and yet we're saying that China's the #1 threat seems pretty, to me, that's a form of overreaction. So I'm not too optimistic that the United States will adjust its policies, but I think that all of us, including organizations like yours and China scholars like me, need to be urging our government to think rationally rather than emotionally about the trade-offs in our policies. So we should be thinking about the costs and benefits of different actions we take vis-a-vis China. Right now, we're not doing that, in my opinion. And so I think we need to help our government do that as best we can.
Chi-Hong, can you read out the question that we have selected to the professor? And
okay, yeah. The first question is from Professor Stephen Pei. People in Taiwan is very concerned if the US keep provoking the tension across the Taiwan Strait. Then we may put people in Taiwan in the same situation as people in Ukraine. What's your thought on
that? People in Taiwan are concerned that who is making for greater tension?
US is provoking the tension.
Well, I guess I don't agree with the premise of the question. I am somewhat critical of the Biden administration for the kind of confusing statements about Taiwan that come from the administration, a lack of clarity for sure. But the bottom line, as is repeated many times by the administration, is that we continue to uphold our one China policy, and we are not trying to maintain stability across the strait and not trying to change US Taiwan policy or cross-strait policy. We certainly maintain the Taiwan Relations Act, and so US policy fundamentally hasn't changed, although there are the high-level visits, things like Speaker Pelosi's visit, send some confusing signals for sure. And so, the problem, of course, is that it's really being driven primarily by Congress. Congress is wants to show how much it loves Taiwan, but in the process of showing how much it loves Taiwan, it uses symbolic acts rather than actually strengthening military deterrence of Taiwan. And these symbolic acts are highly provocative, not just to Xi Jinping and the government in Beijing, but to the population on the mainland as well. So, but I don't really think that's the whole story by any means, because if you look at the actions of the mainland government, they have been flying across the midline in the Taiwan Strait way before Speaker Pelosi's visit. And they've been putting increasing military pressure on Taiwan, and they cut off all communication with the Taiwan government as soon as Tsai Ing-wen was elected. Tsai Ing-wen, I think, is a very reasonable political leader who might have been a very good dialogue partner for Xi Jinping. But he opted to refuse to have dialogue with her because she wouldn't utter the magic words, as I jokingly call them, of the 1992 consensus. But, that was quite short-sighted on the part of the mainland government. So I'd say the pressure to destabilize the situation is coming from two of the three sides of this triangular relationship right now, from the mainland government and to a certain extent from Washington as well. And of course, what really worries me is what happens after the next election in Taiwan.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Kwang Lee. Do you think the push to be harshly crashing every front of the US-Sino relationship will benefit the US eventually? Why or why not?
The push to be harsh, you said?
Yes, yeah. To be harshly crashing every front of the US-Sino relationship.
To confront China on every domain, every continent. No, this is really what came out of the Trump administration. And I think, many of us had hoped to see some moderation of that approach under the Biden administration and have been disappointed not to have seen that. But I think the United States should think about its own values and interests and pursue them, not to confront China in every respect. And I think it will backfire, as I said in my book talk, in that it will harm our own competitiveness. The strength of America really comes from its openness.
Thank you, Professor Shirk. The next question is actually from two people, from Justin and Henry Wang. It's something regarding the word you used in your book about derailed process. Mm-hmm. Justin asking, what do you think, since when the derailed process started? Do you think China is aware of it? Henry asked, does China have option to not be derailed from her rising?
Yes, I I think this is one of the important themes of my book, that none of what has happened over the past 15 years was inevitable. There are many analysts who would say that it's all about China just getting stronger. It's the Thucydides trap. You know, it's that China's the rising power. As it gets stronger, it's bound to act more aggressively internationally and repressively at home. I don't think any of this was inevitable. I think these were choices that political figures made about how to set up the political system, the type of policy process, and then the overreach is a consequence of that. So I think there's a lot of human agency. And what's important about that is it means the future is not inevitable either. In other words, smart diplomacy from both sides, I think, might be able to turn this around and get us back on a good track. And that means inside China too, that that wise policy can get China back on the track of a priority on its own economic development and a peaceful rise.
Okay, do we have time to get in one more? Okay.
Yes, one more.
Okay, the next question is from April Qin. What is the strategies does US and the G7 have to limit China's growth and the rise to the world #1 power?
What strategies does it have to limit China's rise? Well, I think we see this playing out, and the focus is on technology. Various restrictions against scientific collaboration, investment. We're about to see in the United States, I fear, restrictions on outbound investment by Americans in Chinese firms. We already have some of that in a blacklist from the Pentagon of military affiliated firms. But I think it may bleed over into various other areas very soon. It's certainly being discussed within the Biden administration. To me, this is kind of shocking. These are global capital flows that are, huge amounts of money. And it's such a key part of the global market economy. And yet what we see is the United States politicizing the market economy in the way the Chinese side has politicized its own economy. So I think it's very regrettable, and it's hard to see how it won't lead to some form of military confrontation.
Chi-Hung, shall we open up to a few more questions from the audience? I see some hands up there.
Yes.
And how about Jocelyn Lee? You've been raising your hand for a long time.
Yes, I have some comments about this. So thank you, Professor Shirk, for speaking here. I'm very glad to hear that you're suggesting diplomacy instead of confrontation, which I think is never a good idea. Wars are awful. But I do have a feeling that all the analysis and conclusions and your perspectives are based on this very idea of American exceptionalism, which itself is very controversial and debatable. I know among politicians, this is generally what I think. But as a scholar, I thought you were going to be thinking about something else. But it was kind of disappointing that you're being very critical. And I think being critical about China is easy. And I don't think everything about China is great. There are many, many problems. But I do think there's something we can learn from China's experience. There's something good about it. And just the whole thing about overreaching of China policies and all that, it sounds like another way to say China threat, which is not good to Chinese Americans at all. So I just want your response to that comments. Thank you very much.
Well, you know, I wrote my book very much with the thought that I want to write a book that Chinese people in China can learn from, and that will reflect my own perspective of a lifetime of friendship with Chinese people, many hours, happy hours spent in China interviewing people. I hope that when you read the book, you'll see that it is intended as a kind of clear-eyed, objective view of Chinese policy process over the past 15 years or longer, in the hope that we might get back on a more constructive track. So it's certainly not a reflection of any kind of personal animosity, and to the contrary, it's really aimed at the Chinese audience in a lot of ways. And certainly my dedication, the book is dedicated to friends and colleagues who have helped me understand China over many years. So let me know what you think after you read the book.
Okay, thanks. I got many hands up, and we have very limited number of time. I would pick the next one who raised up the hand earlier, Mr. Tu, please.
Yes, thank you, Hai-Pei. Hello, Professor Shirk. Actually, I'm one of your earliest readers. I read your first book. Thanks for your sharing today. My question is, actually, this opinion, they believe today, what Xi Jinping did is an inevitable tendency. You know, people believe they became rich, then they try to turn to their ideology. Just like we can look at Iran, when they have the modernization, they have the back and forth, you know. So I want to listen to you. What do you think? Maybe there's no Xi Jinping, there's Wang Jinping, someone else. Anyway, is it inevitable?
Yeah, no, I don't agree with the idea that it was inevitable. And in fact, I thought it was very surprising that as China became more open to the world, more modern, more affluent, better educated, that it returned to strongman leadership. And I actually think that it was the result of Deng Xiaoping's failure to de-Maoize sufficiently. You know, he believed that if he strengthened the collective institutions inside the party, they would be an adequate check on over-concentration of authority at the top. But it's obvious that that's not the case. But Deng was unwilling to go even further to create checks on the top leadership from outside the party. He could have done that by giving the National People's Congress more power, China's legislature, or creating a court system that had some real independence in order to check the actions of top party politicians. And in fact, there are other authoritarian regimes that have gone in that direction. But Deng Xiaoping, even though he's kind of the hero of my book, he had his own limitations and he didn't go that far. So, you know, these were the choices of politicians. And and in the future, there'll be more choices by politicians. So I don't believe that any of this is inevitable. And that gives me some hope for the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shirk. I will read your new book.
Great.
We have just passed the time. If Professor Shirk allows a few more time, at least got one or two more questions you can answer quickly. Next is Mr. Chai, Jay Chai. Are you there? You are muted. Okay.
Hi, thank you for speaking to us. My question is, it's more on the ideology. The more, you know, I've been in the US since the mid-80s. As a student, you know, over the years, you know, we become more westernized. We were hoping that China, you know, will become more liberal direction. I guess, you know, maybe our hope did not materialize, you know, after 40 years. The more and more you see the disagreement is really boiled down to ideology, you know, capitalism, liberalism versus socialism and communism, sometimes even, you know, state versus private enterprise, that kind of thing. And I think you have put a lot of emphasis on China reform in order to come closer to perhaps the Western ideal, if you will. But I think it is such a too extreme, not extreme, I'm saying two different ideology. My question is, if both sides do not want to give in, you know, how can we really reach some kind of peaceful resolution? Where can we do, what should we do to find some kind of middle ground between two ideologies, so to speak?
And
Well,
that's
you know,
speaking.
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
Yeah, question is over. What's the US China need to do to find some middle ground, really on the background of these ideology differences?
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, China has been a communist country since 1949, and in this period between 79 and 2006, 7, 8, we managed to get along pretty well together, even though we had very different values, different political systems, and yet, and China was growing rapidly, right on the heels of the United States, but both countries managed to find ways of working out differences diplomatically. It wasn't all smooth sailing. We had Tiananmen, 1989, but by and large, it was a pretty successful experiment. So then at the 19th Party Congress 5 years ago was really the moment where Xi Jinping started talking about China as a more successful model for the rest of the world. He, in his work report, unfortunately, the United States kind of responded by talking more about the differences in our system and trying to defend democracy just at a time that American democracy actually is operating not very well. So I agree with you that this is a kind of Cold War ideological framing of the relationship, which is not very helpful. Unfortunately, I think we've reached the hour and I have something else that I have to do, I'm embarrassed to say. So I'm afraid I had better say farewell, and thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about my book.
Thank you very much, Professor, and I thank you for a wonderful talk. And I would encourage everybody to get a copy of the book and read it, and maybe get back to the professor, whatever your view is. So you can go to 20th Century Center there. Yeah, I guess there's some way you can leave a message or some kind. And thanks also for the 21st Century staff and the UCA staff for making this possible. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.